Hey, welcome to Worship Tutorials. My name is Bradford. Today we're going to be offering something that I can't believe we haven't done yet. We're going to be talking about how to set your amps. I'm going to be showing you on my HC30, but all these principles still very much should apply to digital things. If they don't, well, so more of the kind of things that it's not going to apply to is like a capture device, like a Tone X1. If you're using captures on a Quad Cortex or a Kemper, those things have already been captured. There's a little bit of more of a different approach with those. But we're talking about like a modeler where you have the full modeled amp. This is going to be kind of similar because you're setting tones from nothing a lot of times. And so we're going to talk about that. You'll see on this amp, we'll cut to it. You got a volume knob. You actually got two volume knobs and a master. And you got 4 jacks. It's a 2-channel amp. I wouldn't really say it's 2-channel because like it's not a channel switching amp. It's a little different. The 2 inputs are high and low. So if you have high output pickups, you use the high input, and so it knocks off a little bit at the front end. Doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. If you want to plug into the high, I would say it actually gives you a touch more headroom, and that's kind of the goal there. I'm using the 12AX7 channel. That's my preference. I would say it's very important to understand your gear and understand how it works. I could talk about that all day, but that's going to help you way more get the sounds you want than if you just go blindly. And there's something to be said for just blindly messing with stuff and learning things, and that's great. But if you learn how things are done and the rules, quote unquote, then you'll understand how to break them, or you understand why you do or don't like things. Way more beneficial. But the 12AX7 channel is still my preferred thing. You'll see on the amp, yes, 2 volumes and a master. Everything is at 0. I did that just so you could get an idea. I just feel like maybe this is a better example if everything's at 0 instead of me just showing you my settings. I don't know if you can tell too much, but the master volume knob is pulled out. On this amp in particular, if you keep the master volume pushed in, then it removes the master from the circuit. It sounds great to me, like just the amp sounds good that way. But it sounds like a great idea to just remove the master volume because it sounds like, oh, that means I can get the full volume out of the circuit and whatnot. Sure, if you want to. But I would say the master volume, I think, is misunderstood in some ways. Wouldn't say I completely understand all the technical side of things, but even in the digital world, you don't want to just go cranking the master volume up because that's going to saturate an amp in a way that you may not want. And actually, contrary to what you may think, the headroom may not be there like you think it may be there just because you cranked it up. Amps all work a little bit differently, but typically the relationship between the volume and the master, the gain and the master, depending on what it may be labeled, they do work together, but they just work on different parts of the circuit. So what I like to do, and you'll probably see other channels have talked about the same thing, is you just put everything at noon. Why? Because, I don't know, I feel like there's this idea that amp makers want everything to sound great at noon, but it kind of depends on what you're doing. Some amps, your knobs at noon, you go counterclockwise, it takes away, and you go clockwise and it adds. Basically here, and a lot of amps, which is interesting, I found this out, a lot of times your bass knob is not really a bass knob as much as it is a high pass, and your treble knob is a low pass. So what you're actually doing in some cases when you turn up the treble knob is you're cutting bass as opposed to adding treble. And when you're turning up the bass knob, what you're doing is cutting highs as opposed to adding bass. So I don't think that really matters because if it sounds good, it is good, but it also has helped me with my approach. There's also a cut here. This cut is a global cut. On the second channel, you have volume and tone, and the tone's actually a click wheel. So it's a little different. You don't have as much control, but I don't think you need that on an amp that's made really, really well. But let's just do this. Again, all knobs are off right now, so I'm just going to go and turn everything up to noon. I'm using my UA aux box with a set of greenbacks as the speakers. The reason being is like an older Matchless had a greenback kind of variant in a way. There's just nothing the same. Nowadays, my cab that I got with this came with like 2 different offset mix match greenbacks. They're cool. I just don't really, I like the tightness more of like the greenbacks than the creambacks. They roll off some highs, which I kind of want on the Matchless, but it is cool because it means you get a softer and more delicate, like chimey high end, which some people may like more. It's all preference. Running down the rabbit hole of speakers and tubes, like I said, I mean, it's deep. Learning all that stuff, that's not what we're talking about right now. But let's put everything at noon. We'll see how it sounds. do like that as a sound for guitar, but problem here, too much gain. And if you start throwing in, you start boosting things and you start putting lots of wet effects in here, you're going to get like this sound like it's hitting a wall, and your wet effects will probably not trail off as beautifully as you want. Your trail off isn't going to be like just a nice gradual thing. You may just hear it kind of drop off like quickly, and that's not the pedal's fault. That's because the amp is being pushed really hard and it's compressing. And so if you're trying to do a lot of driving and stuff, you can set it like this. This would be, and even hotter actually, I would say this would be like one of the 3 ways you could set up an amp. The 4th way being like all out, huge Marshall sounds, running like a Bogner Shiva, like these kind of things that like, it's a different thing. If you're trying to get multiple sounds out of an amp, especially an amp that doesn't do channel switching, I wouldn't run this any hotter. What I would do at this point would be pushing the amp with pedals and not really using as much gain on the pedal. If you do that, if you do this approach and you use your pedals that way, you're going to want to use volume more than the gain on the pedal, right? And that is going to be pushing the amp more than anything. You're not going to be getting as much of the character of the drive pedal as you are the amp, because you're pushing the amp harder and hotter. Also, when you do that, like I said, and if you're running big wet effects into the front of an amp, that's what's going to cause that like hitting a wall of sound. And I don't think in the best way. That's not my preference. You can make adjustments to the mix, the decay, the pre-decay on wet effects. That'll be another video. But for right now, just in the amp realm of things, that would not be my preference, even though I think this sounds awesome. Now, what would I do to make this better? Again, everything's basically at noon. Maybe bring the cut down a bit. Maybe bring the bass down a touch too, and proportionally move the treble up. And I mean, I'm running single coils. I'm running a Tele with single coils, and that's what I'm doing. So basically, I went like 1 number on the clock either direction with bass and treble. Bass, I went to 11. Treble, I went to 1. What's that sound like? That sounds awesome. I love that so much. But again, hottest I would ever consider running an amp when I was trying to run effects into the front of it. You can, in fact, run the volume knob back. I mean, that was almost halfway. It's probably like at 6. I don't have numbers on the knob. It's probably about 8. Now that's a great sound right there. Here's more like 7. Okay, so yeah, you heard they started getting a little thinner as I rolled the volume knob back to 7. Like I said, this is about the hottest I would run an amp. Would only really use pedals to draw as boosts instead of actual drive. This is the hottest I'd run it, so let's go back a little bit, and I'm going to show you. Basically, as we go down, I'm going to show you where I would run it. It's basically where we're going to end up. Okay, so I brought the volume down a little bit more, which means it's a little cleaner. It's still got gain on it, but I got to dig into it. I want to be able to throw a couple strums at a rather like normal pace. I'm not doing it lightly, but I'm also not digging. Just hitting. And it's clean in that regard. This is about where I would run the amp for me. Barely playing, just like a nice steady strum. Don't really hear any gain. You dig in and you're going to get more out of it. I tend to gravitate towards this sound. I would actually say that maybe what I really want to hear is a little bit less gain on the amp. I don't really know. I can't really explain it. Sometimes I know things that I want to do and I just don't do it. This just sounds too good to me. I didn't touch the EQ. I didn't touch the cut. But it's still there. There's drive. Now, talking about EQ, because I didn't really talk about that in the first example, how should you go about setting up EQ? I like to hear my drive sound, and I want it to cut, but I don't stay there. I know a lot of people like to stay in their bridge pickup, and that's their preference. I like using both pickups, well, in the middle position as well. So I start there, bridge pickup, and then I switch to the neck pickup. See right there, it feels a little thin. However, I also tend to run a compressor set lightly, but it pushes the amp a little bit. And for whatever reason, I'll be more likely to use a drive pedal on a lighter gain neck pickup sound than I would be to just automatically use a drive pedal on a bridge pickup sound. It's a different approach for me. But it definitely has a lot of mids, that's kind of a signature thing here. But it's very dynamic, and I don't really use my volume knob all that much to clean stuff up. That's just not my thing. I just don't want to rely on myself getting to that in the middle of playing. But if I just go a little bit, like 9. I like that. But I would probably want, this is the rub, I would want that bridge pickup to cut a little bit more, but I also would like that neck pickup to be a little bit warmer, and that's when I would start using more drive pedals. And I would start here would be where I'd be like, okay, let me see what happens when I turn drive pedals on, use stuff differently. All right, let's move on to the third idea of how an amp, I think, should be set up. I keep saying that. Just want to make sure it's clear, because a lot of people think that somebody on the internet makes a video and they're trying to be an expert, where, I mean, I would consider myself one in various ways, but at the same time, I'm also just offering my opinion and giving some people some ideas on how to do things. So let's clean this amp up some. Okay, so I didn't bring it down all that much. Volume is now about at 9 o'clock, whereas it was just at 10, and maybe it was like between 10 and 11, and the first clip it was at noon. These knob positions aren't going to be the exact same thing for every amp. The idea here is more so you can hear what's happening, but like this amp, if I go much less than 9 o'clock, I'm not going to have much signal to begin with. So here's this. It may be subtle, but it definitely feels different, which is also important. I'm like pushing, and it doesn't really break up all that much. It's doing it a touch. I wouldn't call this clean because there's not enough room. If we wanted to do that, well, I'll showcase that in a second by pushing the master. And just as a reminder, I haven't touched the master since we started this. This would be about as clean as I would suggest going. In the first example, way more gain, right? I said if you used your drive pedals as boost, you'd be getting the sound of your amp more than anything. The color would come from the amp. The drive pedals would do a little bit of that, but it wouldn't be the same thing. Because if you try to put more gain into the amp when it was that hot, you're gonna get lack headroom, is gonna compress more. And that's not what you always want. So use things differently. When you had the gain in the last example, a little bit hotter, definitely more on the edge of breakup, really. This is like not quite to breakup, but almost there. When you have it on breakup, like I had it in that second clip, you can do a little bit of both. Use a drive to push the amp, you get the character of the amp. Don't use as much volume, but use more gain, you get the character of the pedals. In this example, that's what's happening, but it's about all that's happening. I would say, like, you wouldn't want to just push the amp with volume. You could, and that'll sound great, but I don't prefer that. I would say what you're going to do here is you're going to use a little bit more gain on the pedals, which means you're going to get more character out of the pedals, like the pedals character. If that's what you want, this is what you would do. Now, again, here's that. Like I said, probably a little too clean for me, but I'm not mad about how that sounds. At this setting, let's just turn the master volume up so you can hear what happens. Master is cranked, and I think some people would expect there to be more headroom, but it's maybe subtle, but we got more gain out of the thing. And that's because it's a different section, I guess. I'm not 100% sure, like I've said. you're running, the master is at a different part of the circuit than the volume and the gain part is. So different tubes are driving, and while it's not heavy, it's more than when it was at noon. So if you're running an amp like this, or an amp with a master volume, and you like running things a little bit cleaner, I would say that's where you may want to turn the master up, because then you have a little bit more room to play with things. But at the end of the day, it's all going to come down to you running things how you would like to do it. Let's run master at 2. And let me put 1:30, 2 o'clock. And let me put volume back at like 11. So I gave the master more and put this is more like the second territory. I'm probably going to do, I brought the cut down, left the master, brought the volume down a little bit. Yeah, now that'd be about where I run it, maybe, depending on my mood. Again, this is all subjective, and I just wanted to showcase just some thoughts and some processes behind like how to approach setting up an amp. And this will apply to a lot of different amps. Okay, so I'm going to show you real quick also, if you're setting up stereo, this is something that I think it's a very simple concept to a certain extent, but it also is very misunderstood. So I just want to show very quickly how I would go about setting up stereo. This is the UA console app. It's what you use to control all your inputs when you have universal audio stuff. But if you look at it, you should see things that are very familiar or similar to what like a mixing board looks like in a lot of ways. Up top here, you'll see this circle with a line through it. That's flipping phase. These amps were not in phase together, even though, you know, I can show you that real quick. The way I test that, first off, is I have these both amps set up here, and they're running mono. That's important to hear. That way you can hear them stack on top of each one, or stack together. So running mono. I don't hate that sound. Like that's not a, that's a very mild case of out of phase. But if I flip the phase on one, so you see right there, it's already sounds more full. So that's how you just choose out of the two, because you can't, on most boards, you can't dial the phase. That's another thing too. So all right, back to stereo. Here's what I did here. These are the two channels I'm using. A lot of these details are specific to my scenario. Down here though, I'm running out of the auxes. Again, just how I'm doing it here. But important to note here, you cannot just run a 1/4 inch out, because I just want to save you. You cannot just run a 1/4 inch out of just about every guitar amp and just go straight to front of house. You can't do that. Some amps do in fact have direct out options. I would be very careful before I did that. I'd be very careful and make sure I understood completely what's going on. Amps like the Rev D20 and D25, D40, whatever, they have these 2-note stuff built in, and it's actually made for that. Some amps have line out, and they kind of, it's a different thing, but I'm not doing that. I'm using the aux, which is taking the speaker load and it's handling it in the proper ways, just so you know. It's just way easier than me miking up amps here. But as I do that, I run both my channels to the board. In this case, it's my Apollo, and I pan one hard pan left, you see right here, hard pan right, you see that right here. That is important, because you're not going to get stereo if you do that. So let's just do this. Let me put them back up, straight up and down first. And let me just let you hear them. That was what I was showing you earlier with the polarity. Let me turn that off or flip it again. Sounds weird. Now, if I were to just pan these and not adjust polarity, I don't know what you're hearing, because I don't know what kind of device you're on. I mean, I would really suggest putting some headphones on. It doesn't sound bad. It sounds pretty wide, and I hear that and I'm like, I'm gonna check something. So let me show you again, and then I'll flip it. When you're running stereo amps together and you don't have any effects on, it really should sound, when it's coming to your ears, it really should sound like you're only hearing one amp. Maybe a little bit different character-wise, but they should sound pretty similar. Should sound like one cohesive signal. That Add a phase sound is obvious to me. I feel like something's weird. I can hear like this image, it's wider than it should be. It just has width that I wouldn't expect to have. So there you go. Okay, so we're running the amps hot here, like the first example. Here is some big effects. I'm running dual drives, and I'm running my drives like I normally would. If I was gonna do a lead, I'd be stacking these things. So here's just like me playing a lead with these amps running dirty. You were just hearing that. And here is all these effects on like I normally would set everything. Dual drives, which I would go to for a lead. Okay, to me, I hear the effects kind of like hang on longer and then kind of dip off. That's not what I want. I don't think that's a terrible sound. That's just not what I would like to hear. That's just not how I would go about it. Here's what I would do. I have gain set a little higher. I turn gain down even more. Volume up a bit more, and I would just use drives as boost instead. Step on another boost maybe. So what I just did there was I ran two drives, but I ran the green side of the protein on that one, and this Uno, which is from Santono Effects, and I use them more to push the amp as opposed to adding gain. A lot less gain. Amps are dirtier. Here's just, you know, a reminder. Here's what the amps sound like on their own. I don't hate that sound. It's not a bad sound. It's not my preference. Let me show you how I would utilize these things when I have things a little more cleaner. Okay, so amps now are in that like 2 category, right? Where I told you was kind of my preference. They're a little clean, but they when you dig in, you got them. They got some hair. This is just the Matchless. That sounds very similar to what I was showing you earlier. Dig in, you get a little more gain. Let me mute that. I'm going to show you. This is, by the way, I didn't tell you, this is a third power dual Citizen. It's got like Fender cleans on one side and like an AC30 on the other. I like using it just for its AC30 sound, but here it is. So same idea, it's not really dirty until you kind of push it. But I also like running amps this way where one's a little dirtier than the other. It gives some nice separation. And now, here's the same effects. And now here are 2 drive pedals for a lead. Amps are a little cleaner, was using the same stacked drives, it's the Protein again, green and blue side, as the first stereo sample I showed you, except the wet effects gradually drop down, more pleasing to me. That would be my preference. That's where I like to sit. That's how I like to do things. These amps are, funny enough, the knobs are in very similar positions, even though they're different amps, which is kind of interesting to me as well. But still, same exact verb and delay preset, and I just really like how that sits because the wet effects trail down a little bit. They're not overpowering as I'm playing the lead. The first clip, they were kind of like booming around what I was playing, and you could make adjustments on those effects if you wanted to. That is obviously, yes, duh, but I'm trying to showcase the difference because it's just you may not get the same effect out of it because your amps are dirtier. Now, let me show you what it's like when you run things considerably cleaner. Back in the same general idea of where we were for like level 1, rather clean. I have a compressor on. I should leave that off. So the two amps together, they sound a little dirtier, but that's because the frequencies of the amps, they sound different. It just, when you kind of isolate them, it feels different. So here's just the C-30. I can clean that up a bit more. Yeah, there we go. That's a little cleaner. And here's just the Dual Citizen. A little brighter, a little snappier too. But I'll clean that up a touch more too. Okay, drives are set the same way, same delay from the H90. Okay, so I could just be splitting hairs here. Maybe it's confirmation bias. Maybe I'm hearing what I want to hear. But what I heard was that the wet effects didn't just casually drop off. They kind of like in steps, still rather smooth. To me, still preferred over level 3. You know, it just doesn't feel, it's not an official thing. So what that sounds like to me is because the amps just they don't have enough sustain underneath them too. I didn't hate how that sounded. It meant the verb, again, it's the same preset. So just to hear a difference there. The verb just didn't, it was even less boomy around the sound. It wasn't like clouding everything like it was. It's not a cloud verb, it's a Hall verb. The level 3, it was just everywhere. Level 2, I thought sat a little bit better for my preference. Level 1 sat better, but I don't think it was necessarily my preference. I had to add more gain on the green side of the protein, and I rarely add the gain past 9, 10 o'clock, and it's like at 11:30 right now, gain-wise. So just some examples of, again, some stereo information, because stereo is awesome, and that's what I prefer to do. But also just so you can get an idea of how these all things sound differently back to back and how they interact with wet effects, the exact same settings and all that, just to give you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about further.